Here is a fun fact that your history teacher definitely skipped. The Roman Empire, the most powerful political entity the Western world had ever produced, the civilization that built the Colosseum and the aqueducts and the legal system that modern democracies still run on, paid a barbarian king not to attack them. Not once, not twice, every single year. For decades, they called it a tribute. The barbarian king called it what it actually was: rent. You are living in my territory now, pay me or I will burn everything you've ever built. And Rome paid, because the alternative was Attila. At his peak, Attila the Hun controlled a territory stretching from the Rhine River in the west to the Caspian Sea in the east. He invaded the Eastern Roman Empire not once, not twice, but 3 times, sacking city after city, destroying everything in his path. He invaded the Western Roman Empire and drove so deep into Italy that the Pope himself, Pope Leo I, had to ride out personally to beg him to stop. The Pope begged a barbarian to please not destroy Rome. And here is the part nobody talks about. It worked. Attila turned around and left. Nobody fully understands why. This is the story of Attila the Hun, the man who called himself the Scourge of God, made emperors cry, turned the most powerful empire in the world into his personal ATM, and died on his wedding night under circumstances so bizarre that historians are still arguing about them 1,500 years later. But before we get into the part where a pope has to personally beg a warlord not to destroy civilization, welcome to Sketchy Past Fast History. Zero fluff, maximum chaos. If this is your first time here, subscribe right now and join the Sketchy Empire. We've been building toward this episode for weeks, and trust me, Attila does not disappoint. Let's go. To understand why Attila was so effective, you need to understand the world he was born into, because by the early 400 SAD, Rome was not the Rome of Julius Caesar or Augustus. It was something far more complicated, far more fragile, and far more vulnerable. The Roman Empire had been officially split in two in 395 AD. The Western Roman Empire centered in Rome, and later Ravenna, and the Eastern Roman Empire centered in Constantinople. This division made administrative sense on paper. In practice, it meant 2 governments, 2 armies, 2 treasuries, and 2 sets of political problems, none of which were being solved particularly well by either half. The Western Empire was in deep trouble. Its tax base was shrinking. Its army was increasingly composed of barbarian mercenaries, whose loyalty was transactional at best. Its political class was consumed by internal power struggles. Emperors were being made and unmade by generals with alarming regularity. The infrastructure that had made Rome great, the roads, the aqueducts, the grain supply, was deteriorating. The Eastern Empire was in better shape, mostly because Constantinople was more defensible. Its economy was more robust, and it had better access to the wealth of the Eastern Mediterranean, but it was still hemorrhaging money on military campaigns and paying enormous sums to keep various barbarian groups from raiding its borders. Into this environment, a Roman world that was rich enough to be worth raiding but weak enough to be vulnerable, came the Huns. The Huns were a nomadic people from the Eurasian steppe, and their origins are genuinely mysterious. Ancient sources describe them in terms that suggest they found the Huns almost incomprehensibly alien. Their appearance, their lifestyle, their fighting style were all so different from anything the Mediterranean world had encountered that Roman writers struggled to describe them in familiar terms. Some Roman sources literally questioned whether the Huns were fully human. What the Huns were, in practical military terms, was extraordinarily effective. They were among the finest horse archers in the world, capable of firing composite bows with deadly accuracy at full gallop, using tactics that relied on speed, mobility, and the ability to strike and withdraw before an enemy could organize a response. They lived on horseback, campaigned on horseback, and could cover distances in a day that infantry armies needed a week to march. When the Huns arrived on the European steppe in the late 300 SAD, they didn't just raid, they displaced. Entire peoples, Goths, Vandals, Burgundians, were pushed west and south by Hunnic pressure, crashing into Roman territory like a wave. The Great Migration period that ultimately ended the Western Roman Empire was set in motion, at least partially, by the Huns pushing everyone else. By the time Attila was born, probably around 406 AD, The Huns had already established a dominant presence in the region north of the Danube River, in what is now Hungary and Romania. They had already extracted tribute from the Eastern Roman Empire. They had already demonstrated that they were not a temporary raiding problem, but a permanent military and political reality that Rome had to manage. Attila grew up watching Rome pay. He filed that observation carefully. Attila came to power through a path that was, by the standards of the ancient world, relatively straightforward and only mildly involving fratricide. The Hunnic leadership structure was not a simple hereditary monarchy. It was more of a confederation of tribal leaders under a paramount chief, with power distributed among a ruling family. When Attila's uncle Ruger, the paramount chief who had been extracting tribute from Rome, died around 434 AD, power passed jointly to Attila and his brother Bleda. Joint rulership of a military confederation is almost always unstable. In 445 AD, Bleda died. The ancient sources are vague about the circumstances. Attila became sole ruler of the Hunnic Empire. The timing of Bleda's death, the manner of it, and Attila's immediate consolidation of complete power afterward have led most historians to conclude the obvious. Attila himself never addressed the subject, which is itself a kind of answer. What Attila did with sole power was immediately, dramatically, and unmistakably clear. He went to war with Rome. But here is what made Attila different from every other barbarian leader who had raided Roman territory before him. He understood that the goal wasn't to destroy Rome. The goal was to make Rome pay. Destruction was expensive. Occupation was expensive. Governance was expensive. But fear was cheap, and fear was renewable. And a Rome that was terrified of Attila was a Rome that would keep paying tribute indefinitely. Attila was not running a raid. He was running a protection racket, and he was extraordinarily good at it. He also had something else that most barbarian leaders lacked, a sophisticated political intelligence operation. He maintained agents in Constantinople and Ravenna. He understood Roman internal politics, who was competing with whom, which factions were ascendant, where the empire was most vulnerable. He used this intelligence to time his campaigns for maximum Roman weakness and minimum Roman resistance. He also used Roman defectors and allies strategically, most notably a Roman general named Aetius, who had actually lived among the Huns as a hostage in his youth and maintained a complex, mutually useful relationship with Attila for years. Attila understood, in other words, that the political and the military were inseparable. You didn't just hit Rome with an army. You managed Rome, kept it off, balanced, divided, uncertain, and willing to pay rather than fight. The Eastern Roman Empire, richer, better organized, and more defensible than the West, was Attila's primary cash source, and he milked it with systematic efficiency. The relationship between Attila and the Eastern Emperor Theodosius II was one of the more remarkable dynamics in late antique history. Theodosius was, by most accounts, a scholar and administrator more than a military commander, personally devout, intellectually serious, and deeply unsuited to the kind of brutal realpolitik that dealing with Attila required. Attila exploited this completely. The existing tribute arrangement when Attila took sole power was already significant, around £700 of gold per year flowing from Constantinople to the Huns. Attila, shortly after consolidating power, sent envoys to Theodosius with a demand, double it. Theodosius, after what was probably a deeply uncomfortable conversation with his finance ministers, agreed. This set the pattern. Attila would make a demand, Rome would negotiate, Attila would threaten military action, Rome would pay, repeat. But in 441 AD, Attila decided that the tribute payments had been arriving inconsistently. There were disputes about amounts, timing, and the return of Hunnic refugees who had fled to Roman territory. Whether these were genuine grievances or manufactured pretexts is debated. The practical effect was that Attila launched his first major invasion of Eastern Roman territory. The results were catastrophic for Rome. Hunnic forces swept through the Balkans, modern-day Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, destroying city after city. Nisus, modern Nife in Serbia, one of the most important cities in the Balkans and the birthplace of the Emperor Constantine, was so thoroughly destroyed that when Roman ambassadors passed through the area years later, they reportedly found the surrounding countryside still littered with bones. The Eastern Roman army sent to stop the Huns was defeated in multiple engagements. The Hunnic cavalry was simply too mobile, too fast, and too effective at choosing the terms of engagement for Roman heavy infantry to counter effectively. Theodosius sued for peace. The terms Attila demanded were extraordinary. The tribute was increased to 2,100 pounds of gold per year, 3 times what it had been, plus a massive one, time payment to settle arrears, plus the return of all Hunnic fugitives from Roman territory, plus various territorial concessions. Theodosius paid all of it. A Roman ambassador named Priscus travelled to Attila's court around 449 AD and left one of the most remarkable documents in late antique history, a detailed account of what Attila's headquarters looked like, how he lived, and what kind of man he was. What Priscus found was surprising. Attila's personal lifestyle was austere. He ate from wooden plates while his guests ate from silver, wore plain clothing while his courtiers wore elaborate garments. He was described as short, broad-chested, with a large head, small eyes, a flat nose, and a thin beard going grey. He moved with what Priscus called a dignified gait, and had a habit of rolling his eyes when he was angry, as if the rage was too large to express any other way. He was, in person, not the fire, breathing monster of Roman propaganda. He was a calculating, disciplined, politically sophisticated ruler who had built a functioning imperial court with its own ceremonies, hierarchies, and administrative structures. He was also, when occasion demanded, capable of violence so total and so deliberately theatrical that the stories spread for decades and softened opposition before his armies arrived. By 450 AD, the Eastern Roman Empire had been thoroughly squeezed. Theodosius II died in that year, and his successor Marcian immediately refused to continue the tribute payments, a bold move that reflected both Marcian's different temperament and the genuine fiscal crisis the payments had created. Attila, rather than immediately returning to the east, turned west, and he had a remarkable justification ready. Honoria, the sister of the Western Emperor Valentinian III, had, in a moment of either political desperation or genuine recklessness, sent Attila her ring and a message asking him to help her escape an unwanted engagement. Attila interpreted this, or chose to interpret this, as a marriage proposal. He sent to Valentinian demanding Honoria as his bride and half the Western Empire as her dowry. Valentinian, who had not been consulted about any of this by his sister, said absolutely not. Attila said, "That is fine. I'll come get it." In 451 AD, Attila led an enormous army. Ancient sources suggest somewhere between 200,000 and 700,000 men. Modern historians estimate 100,000 to 200,000 across the Rhine and into Gaul, modern France. He sacked city after city, moving westward. Metz was destroyed on Easter Sunday. Reims, Troyes, Strasbourg, all hit. He was stopped, barely at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains in the 4th of June 51 AD, one of the largest battles of the ancient world. The Roman general Aetius had assembled a coalition force of Romans, Visigoths, Burgundians, and various other peoples, essentially everyone who had reason to fear Attila, and met the Hunnic army in a pitched battle in central France. The battle was brutal and inconclusive. The Visigoth king was killed. The Huns were pushed back but not destroyed. Attila withdrew. This is sometimes described as the battle that saved Western civilization. Whether that is accurate is debatable. Attila hadn't been trying to permanently occupy Gaul, and a Hunnic withdrawal after a costly battle was always the likely outcome, but it was the closest anyone came to stopping him in the field. The following year, 452 AD, Attila invaded Italy. He crossed the Alps, something that recalled Alexander, Hannibal, and every other world historical figure who had done the same, and began systematically destroying cities in northern Italy. Aquileia, one of the largest and most important cities in the Western Empire, was besieged and destroyed so thoroughly that it essentially ceased to exist as a major urban center. Milan, Padua, Vicenza, all sacked. Valentinian fled from Ravenna. The Western Roman government was in chaos. There was no army capable of stopping Attila in the field. And then, on the banks of the Mincio River near the town of Mantua, something happened that has puzzled historians ever since. Pope Leo I rode out from Rome to meet Attila personally. There was no Roman army behind the Pope. There was no military deterrent. There was just an elderly bishop in religious vestments, riding toward the most feared man in the Western world, apparently on the theory that talking was worth trying. The meeting happened, and then Attila turned around, left Italy, and never came back. The ancient sources offer various explanations. Leo himself claimed he had invoked the authority of Saints Peter and Paul, and that Attila had been overcome by spiritual terror. Other sources suggest Attila's army was suffering from disease and supply problems. Still, others point to the fact that Marcian had sent an Eastern Roman army to raid Hunnic territory north of the Danube, while Attila was in Italy, creating a strategic problem he needed to address at home. The most honest answer is, we don't know. The meeting between Leo and Attila is one of the great mysteries of late antique history. A moment where something happened that changed the course of events, and nobody recorded what it actually was. Raphael painted it. The painting is in the Vatican. Attila looks terrified of the two saints appearing in the sky behind the Pope. The historical reality was probably more complicated and less supernatural. Attila returned from Italy in 452 AD, apparently in good health and full of plans. He was assembling forces for another campaign against the Eastern Empire, still furious about Marcian's refusal to pay tribute. His empire was at its territorial peak. His reputation was at its highest point. And then, in early 453 AD, Attila took another wife. Her name was Ildico, described in ancient sources as a young woman of remarkable beauty, apparently of Gothic or Germanic origin. The wedding was celebrated with what ancient sources describe as characteristic Hunnic enthusiasm, meaning enormous quantities of food and alcohol consumed over an extended period. Attila retired to the wedding chamber with his new bride. The next morning, when his attendants came to check on him after he failed to emerge at the usual time, they found the door locked. They knocked, no response. Eventually, they broke down the door. Attila was dead. He was lying on his back, apparently peacefully. Ildico was crouched in the corner, weeping, her face covered with her veil. There was blood, but there were no wounds on his body. The official explanation, accepted by most contemporary sources and most modern historians, is that Attila suffered a massive nosebleed, a condition he apparently had a history of while unconscious from alcohol consumption, choked on his own blood, and died. The greatest military commander of the late ancient world, the man who had brought two Roman empires to their knees, the Scourge of God, suffocated on a nosebleed on his wedding night. Whether you find this darkly comic or simply tragic, probably says something about your general outlook on history. Suspicions fell on Ildico immediately. Romans suspected a Roman plot. Aetius was named by some sources as a possible organizer of an assassination. Others suspected Eastern Roman intelligence, which had both motive and demonstrated capability for this kind of operation. Some modern historians have proposed various medical explanations beyond the nosebleed theory. Nobody was ever charged. Nobody ever confessed. Ildico disappears from the historical record after this night, her fate unknown. Attila was buried in 3 coffins, gold, silver, and iron, somewhere in a river, with the course of the water temporarily diverted to allow burial in the riverbed, then redirected to cover the grave. The slaves who dug the grave were killed afterward to prevent the location from being revealed. His tomb, like the tomb of Genghis Khan, like the tomb of Alexander the Great, has never been found. Attila's death in 453 AD was followed almost immediately by the collapse of everything he had built. His sons, and there were many of them, from many wives, immediately began fighting each other over the succession. The subject peoples of the Hunnic Empire, who had been held together by Attila's personal authority and military genius, saw their opportunity and revolted. The Gepids, a Germanic people who had been under Hunnic control, led a coalition that defeated the Huns at the Battle of Nidau in 454 AD. Within a decade of Attila's death, the Hunnic Empire had essentially ceased to exist as a political entity. The Huns dispersed, absorbed into other peoples and other kingdoms, and faded from history as a distinct group. The terror that had defined the previous generation became a memory, then a legend, then a literary archetype for barbarian destruction. The Western Roman Empire, fatally weakened by decades of Hunnic pressure and the cascade of displaced peoples it had triggered, limped on for another 20 years. In 476 AD, the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer. No new emperor was appointed. The Western Roman Empire ended not with a dramatic final battle, but with a bureaucratic formality. A letter sent to Constantinople saying, essentially, we don't need a Western emperor anymore. The Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, survived for another 1,000 years, until 1453 AD, when Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks. The world Attila left behind was one permanently reshaped by his passage through it. The migration of peoples he accelerated produced the ethnic and political map of medieval Europe. The weakening of Rome he accomplished created the power vacuum that the Christian Church, the Germanic kingdoms, and eventually the feudal system filled. The trade disruptions, the demographic displacements, the destruction of urban centers, all of it fed into the period historians call the early Middle Ages, which used to be called, less charitably, the Dark Ages. Attila didn't cause the fall of Rome by himself. Rome's problems were structural, deep, and long predating his birth. But he accelerated the process with devastating efficiency, and he did it with a sophistication and strategic intelligence that most of his contemporaries, and many later historians, failed to fully appreciate. He wasn't the Scourge of God in the sense his contemporaries meant it, a divine punishment visited on sinful Rome. He was something more interesting and more human. A man of extraordinary ability who looked at the world's most powerful empire, understood exactly where it was weak, and spent his entire career exploiting those weaknesses with cold, systematic precision. He was right about almost everything. He read Rome correctly. He understood power correctly. He built something remarkable from a nomadic base that had no cities, no written language, and no prior tradition of empire. And then he died of a nosebleed. History is never dignified, but it is occasionally very funny. That was Attila the Hun, the man who turned the Roman Empire into his personal protection racket, made the Pope beg him to leave Italy, and died choking on his own blood on his wedding night, after drinking himself unconscious. If this video hit you the way it should, if you are sitting there thinking, why did nobody teach me history like this? Then like this video right now, it tells the algorithm we exist, and the algorithm telling more people we exist is how this channel grows. Subscribe to Sketchy Past if you haven't already. Ring that bell. We are 5 videos in, and the momentum is building. You saw the numbers. Genghis Khan hit 4% Kantar, and we're just getting started. Next episode, we're going after Julius Caesar, the man who conquered Gaul, crossed the Rubicon, got stabbed 23 times by his friends, and somehow still managed to shape the next 2,000 years of Western history. The month of July is named after him. So is the Caesarian section. The man left his mark on literally everything. You don't want to miss it. See you in the next one.